Hey, good Sunday, everybody. Brian Bledsoe with here, host of the Desert Farmer Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. I have a lot of stuff to get through with you today. I know the main hot topic as far as weather and climate is concerned right now really has to deal with the upcoming El Nino event that we are steaming toward. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk specifically about some other oscillations that I think are very important as far as what our weather is going to look like going forward. Also, I'm going to break down some of these analogs in further detail that I've been chatting about in the specific years and the specific months, so you won't want to miss that. I'm also going to talk about the importance of the Atlantic. And basically, this episode of the Desert Farmer Podcast, I understand, is not going to be for everybody. Somebody just wants to say, hey, Brian, can you cut through the horse shit and just tell me if it's going to rain or not and when it's going to rain? You know what? I will. All right. That's the point of this. But I want to be very transparent in the process in showing you why I'm saying the things that I'm saying, using history to base where we're going forward, using the computer modeling to show you where we're going, because there's a lot of forensic evidence out there that shows how this pattern is likely to unfold and move forward. But at the end of the day, it's got to do it. All right. And all of this stuff doesn't mean anything unless it actually happens. I understand that. I understand that a lot of us are dealing with drought right now. I understand that that a lot of us are in a tough spot because of that. But I will say this: if you know weather history and you know how things have behaved in the past when we are doing what we're doing in the Pacific Ocean, then you are very much aware that the pattern that we've been seeing across the Western High Plains and for some areas, a lot of times we'll do a complete 180 once the pattern truly gets into high gear and actually flips. And I think that that's a sound message. The Western High Plains is an extreme place. We know that. It's always been that way, and it always will be. So my main message to you today, much like what I've been saying, is you might be discouraged right now, but let's look ahead and let's see how this thing is likely going to play out going forward. I think that's really an important thing to consider as we're looking down the road. So, bottom line, if you've got something that I can do for you, as I always say, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You know what to do there with my digits, my phone number. Hit up my website, smash the blue bar in the middle, and I will get going to work for you right away. Let's start out with what the current phase is of the Southern Oscillation Index and its historical importance. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the Southern Oscillation, it's basically the La Nina, El Nino pressure patterns that we talk about all the time. Now, the top part of this graphic here is the pressure patterns that are associated with La Nina. So when we have a positive Southern Oscillation Index, we have low pressure over here, which is rising motion, and we have high pressure over here, which is sinking motion. All right, that's what the kind of grays and blacks and the reds and the oranges represent. Down here with a El Nino, when the Southern Oscillation Index is negative, we have sinking air over here, Indonesia, Australia, and rising air that's over here. The pressure pattern just simply flips. So a lot of times that's why El Nino will have drought, wildfires, and whatnot over here in Australia, and La Nina for Australia, you get a lot of rain. All right, and vice versa. That same thing can be said across the Eastern Pacific Ocean in that way. So that's what the Southern Oscillation Index is all about. Right now, we are coming out of that positive phase of the La Nina, and we're moving rapidly into that negative phase. And in some cases, that negative phase, we have fallen off a cliff with the Southern Oscillation Index. Now, I recognize that the SOI isn't the end-all be-all. It's kind of a noisy index at times, and it can kind of, go off the deep end wildly when there's strong tropical activity that's going on, which we have had in the West and Southwest Pacific. If you've been following that, we've had numerous tropical storms and typhoons over there. So early in the season, and some of them have been very powerful. But if you go back to mid-March, all right, in the past month, our 30-day running total here for our Southern Oscillation Index was right there. It was right at about a 15. Today, our 30-day running total for the SOI is at a negative 7.8. All right. And look at the daily contribution to that, a negative 17. All right. These numbers, I just want you to kind of follow along arbitrarily with them. The more positive it is, that's the more La Nina influence. The more negative it is, that's the more El Nino influence. And historically speaking, a lot of times when that Western Pacific Ocean gets active with tropical activity, it oftentimes is the catalyst to really shove our Southern Oscillation Index off a cliff and keep it there as we steam toward this El Nino event. A lot of westerly wind bursts. We're taking warm water in the Western Pacific. We're shoving it farther east. And the Southern Oscillation Index, as you can see here, has been really changing over the past 30 days and really has changed a great deal over the past 2 weeks. You can see the rate of change right there. It's been very impressive. So when we look back through history here, I went through, and broke down several years here. Here we are in 2026, all right, right up here. January Southern Oscillation Index was almost at a positive 10, positive 11 there. We've come back down a little bit in April or in March. I'm really anxious to see what that April version is going to be because I think it's going to be negative, courtesy of what I just showed you. All right, there's no reason why it shouldn't be negative based on what I've just shown you. So we've gone the first 3 months positive, kind of a La Nina influence. April, I think that index is going to be show up quite negative. So if we look back through history with some of those analogs that I broke down with you before in the Desert Farmer podcast, all right, let's look at them. Let's go back here. 2023, what happened there? We were positive for January and February, negative March, negative, and then look what happened in May. Off a cliff. All right, we went from basically neutral here in March and April to off a cliff in May. If you are familiar with what the Western High Plains did in the month of May in 2023, you know that deep negative Southern Oscillation Index was responsible for making things very active. But notice how we kind of relaxed that in June and July. Some of the Western High Plains completely shut off once we got into June and July, especially down there in the eastern portions of New Mexico, West Texas, all right? And then we invigorated again a little bit later on. But 2023 is a little bit of a different animal right there. Let's go back to 2015. Look at this. Southern Oscillation Index was actually negative to start the year, positive briefly there in February, and then went negative full on, all right, with that strong El Nino that developed. So a little bit noisy early on, and then the atmosphere coupled went negative, strongly negative, and stayed there, all right? Let's go to the next one. 2009, I didn't think was a great analog year, but you notice when we made the move toward El Nino, it kind of did the same story. Let's go 97, all right? Look at these. We were positive January and February, and then off a cliff, all right? And then the weather became very active in 97 with that. Let's go back even further here. 1991, not one of my favorite analogs, but you notice the same thing happened here. Look at what we did. Off a cliff in the spring. Things got active. Let's keep going. What about 1982? 1982 right now is one of my favorite analogs because it's behaving very similarly to what we're seeing right now. Look at that. Positive, SOI, off a cliff thereafter. By the time we head into April, especially May, June, July, and thereafter, off a cliff and a very strong El Nino later on. What about 1972? Positive, 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 off a cliff in the spring. 1965. Positive, positive here, negative by April, neutral May, and then boom, sustained negative. 1957. Positive to start, weekly positive there in April, off a cliff in May, a little bit noisy thereafter. But May, you see a lot of these Mays do the same thing when we make a push toward an El Nino episode. And I've said for a long time that I thought May was the pivot month in the west and the southwest high plains. Areas farther east, you can behave a little bit better a little bit sooner. But for southeast Wyoming, western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, western Kansas, eastern New Mexico, the panhandles, West Texas, a lot of times when we move toward that El Nino, May is the pivot month. And a lot of times it continues thereafter, depending on what kind of El Nino that we have. All right. That's the SOI. I think it's a very important metric in terms of where we're moving right now. All right. Just my opinion. Maybe you have different thoughts. That's my opinion. Let's look at what the Madden-Julian oscillation is doing. All right. And it's forecast through early May. Remember, the Madden-Julian oscillation is that cluster of thunderstorms that a lot of times will move through various regions of the Pacific Ocean and across the equator in a 30 to 60 day cycle. And again, it always doesn't behave that way, but a lot of times it does. So what we don't want the MJO to be locked in over here in the Western Pacific. We want that to propagate across the Pacific, because if it does so, that means the lifting mechanism in the atmosphere that is associated with that will propagate accordingly too. So the latest European extended MJO forecast. Here we are up here. All right, we started here. Here we are pivoting out of phase 6 into phase 7. And look at this. This is an MJO cycle of very high amplitude. All right, the farther away you get from the center circle here, or the null space, the more strong of a signal, or the stronger of a signal that you actually have. So we're out here in phase 8, phase 1, right through the end, okay, of April. And then we kind of come into phase 2 and then kind of pivot back here to weekly into phase 8 and 1 again. We are not spending any significant time over in this area with this. Now, again, that's just the European. That's through May 12th. What about the Bureau of Meteorology forecast? Well, it's stronger amplitude, and it really keeps it over here in phase 1 and back into phase 8. It doesn't do anything. When we get into late April, all right, look at it, doesn't do anything like that. It comes right back over into the same spaces. Now, this is a long ways out there in the forecast trend, so there will be some fine tuning of this, but the signal, in my opinion, is undeniable where the MJO is largely going to play. It's largely going to play on this side of the graphic in these phases: 7, 8, 1, maybe a little bit of 2, but generally 7, 8, and 1. So historically, what does that mean for us in terms of precipitation anomalies and composites? All right, well, let's look at phase 7 first. Phase 7, look what it lights up here. Look where the greens are. Southeast Colorado, eastern New Mexico, good part of Texas, Kansas, here into the southeast. Who has been dry here? The southeast has been very dry underneath that ridge of high pressure. I think that there's a shot that that pattern starts to break down. All right. What about phase 8? Phase 8, we kind of keep it dry here again, but look at the areas that light up farther west. All right. And I'll erase that off in case you didn't see that. And up here in phase 1, look at the areas that it favors. All right. That moisture and that energy ends up farther west across the western high plains. We dry things out a little bit here and focus on things a little bit farther west. And even in phase 8, all right, or in phase 1, I should say, look at the east and the southeast. So there's some reason to believe here that the pattern is going to change a little bit and give some water to some folks that have been dry. And it may take until those last few days of April, and once we get into early May to do so. But there's some phase changing here with the MJO and maintenance of the MJO that makes a lot of sense. And notice, we're in phase 6 right now. Look who's been favored as far as being wet. Central and southeast Texas, eastern Oklahoma, Missouri, eastern Kansas. I think areas just south of Marysville, Kansas had about 9 inches of rain this week, on up into parts of the Corn Belt. All right. So when we come out of phase 6, notice into 7, that spreads out a little bit more. 8 focuses farther west, 1 focuses farther west too. Some things to look at here. Okay. Let's move on to the importance of the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. This is something that I've paid a lot of attention to over the past 25 years in terms of seasonal drought risk and forecasting, pairing it with the phases of the Pacific, all right? But the importance of the AMO, I really want to go back through history and kind of show you. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time back deep into this, but this is from Colorado State University, and they use the AMO a lot of times in terms of their hurricane forecast that they put out every year. But notice that back here through the 50s, all right, you can look at these years. The thing that I want you to focus on, especially across the West and the Southwest High Plains and in the high desert, that whenever the AMO is really positive, a lot of times that hurts us in terms of moisture. Whenever it's really negative, it can also hurt us, all right? But it seems like whenever it's really positive, a lot of times that hurts us. So going back through these years, what I'm looking for, I'm not looking for a real positive or real negative. Certainly, I'm looking for something middle of the road here, all right? Around neutral or slightly negative in spots. And you can see here in 1957, all right, in May, we were not as positive, maybe a little positive, but we weren't that crazy, all right? That's important to me. Going forward here. What about 65, all right? Notice we went from somewhat positive into negative here. June, July, August, September. There's a transition. This isn't perfect. I'm not saying that this is a perfect metric, but it's worth looking at. What about the 70s, right? 1972, what we did here. I think we were even a little bit too negative in spots, all right? But notice the negativity here. 80s, what about 1982? As I've said, one of my more favorite analogs going forward. We were positive, neutral. Look at that metric there in March. Negative 0.63, and we kept it negative throughout. We had a warm Pacific with the El Nino and a cool AMO, relatively speaking here. Not off the deep end cool, at least during the spring, but definitely cool, the way this is measured. What about the rest of those 80s and early 90s, all right? Look at this 91, just for an example, all right? Really negative here, less negative, but we kept it that way along with a warm Pacific. And if you want to know why a lot of the 90s were so wet through the plains, because we had a warm Pacific. And look at the coolness here with the AMO. It stayed cool. Keeping that AMO cool, keeping the Pacific warm, a lot of times is a good recipe for the removal of drought in the West and Southwest High Plains. 90s are a classic example of that. Later on in the 90s, what about 1997? Isn't a perfect metric for us, but the same story here. We were slightly positive here, actually, in 1997. But the El Nino was so off the deep end, it really didn't matter. We had a lot of relief there, especially later on. But keep in mind, because the AMO was positive here, it wasn't a perfect year for everybody through there. And I'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. 09. 09, as I said, it's not a favorite of mine because I think the La Nina signal hung on a little bit too long. But look at the AMO. Negative here when we made that transition. Not totally extremely positive here. And then we went negative again. All right. 2015. Very negative AMO. All right. Wet year in the middle part of the country. We were warm in the Pacific with the PDO and the PMM, and we were cool in the Atlantic right there. Here lately, 2023. Look what we did here. Remember how the southern plains shut off and it got hot and dry once we got past early June? Look at this. Not as positive, but look what happened when we got to June. Look at that AMO metric. That is really positive. And we kept it really positive all the way in October. And that summer was brutal in eastern New Mexico, a good part of Texas, southern Oklahoma, southeast Kansas, all the way up into southeast Nebraska. It wasn't great at times, and hot too. So the thing to keep in mind for the summer here is if we don't have that really, really stout positive AMO, a lot of times we don't have to worry about extreme dryness or extreme heat. And look at what we're doing right now. There's 2026. Positive here. All right. A little bit positive, but look at March. We reversed it all the way down here to negative 0.62. Will that continue? I think it's going to. It doesn't necessarily have to go way negative. It's just a matter of it not being completely over the top positive. And if we look at our European seasonal model sea surface temperature anomaly forecast, I want you to focus over here. Do you see the cool water right there south of Greenland? And then look at this area here. It's not that that whole area, and I'm going to do a better job of drawing that, all right? It's not that this whole area is really, really cool. It's just that the focal point of the warmth is positioned farther west. So that right there would largely be an either neutral or negative AMO signal right through the warm season. At the same time, where we have a very positive PMM, Pacific Meridional mode, and we are going gangbusters here with a strong El Nino. Right now, all right, right now, when we have this warmth here and this cool here, that is a very positive recipe for not only drought removal in the middle part of the country, but also no drought building later on, no significant heat building in the middle part of the country later on. It's very important that we focus on that, because historically speaking, that's exactly the signal that it provides. So yes, we are steaming toward an El Nino. This is our current sea surface temperature anomaly. And again, okay, look at what I've shown you over here, all right? That area, that kind of cool horseshoe right there is where we are. Very warm, positive PMM, warming ENSO region, certainly, as those westerly wind bursts continue to shove warm water eastward. And our Indian Ocean is fairly warm, all right? I am not concerned about this right now. The cool water up here in the Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, there have been a lot of storms up there, churning the water, upwelling. I'm not concerned about that. Now, as I erase that, if we were to see this whole area turn cold, I would be singing a lot different tune in terms of drought potential in the middle part of the country. We're not seeing that right now, okay? Not seeing that. Those are the areas that I'm focused on and the regions that I've just showed you, all right? Here's what's going on beneath the surface. I always tell you, think Indonesia over there, think the west coast of South America over here. We're top down, all the way down to 450 meters. Look at the warm water continuing to surge its way eastward beneath the surface. All of that eventually comes to the surface, continues to warm things up here as that westerly, or those westerly wind bursts continue to shove warm water. The Kelvin wave continues to move eastward. You get the drill. And you can see here, the dashed lines, think La Nina when you see that. This goes all the way back here. Look at July. All right. Look at the upwelling, okay, Kelvin waves here. That was our La Nina right there. But since then, really since, I guess you could say, December, and certainly now, there have been some strong downwelling Kelvin waves here, especially the most recent one. That is the switch, complete the switch out of La Nina into El Nino. And our latest Hobmila diagram, okay, this was forecast from tonight all the way through the end of April, at least April 26th here, all right? These were all westerly wind bursts from what we've been seeing. Or this is actually March, sorry. And then down here is where we were with the forecast initializing last night. Really strong westerly wind bursts there. Notice how it just kind of keeps going. all the way out here. All right. Meanwhile, over here, we're doing easterly trades. A very significant El Nino look right there. It means the atmosphere and the ocean are talking. It's basically what this means. We are coupling. And historically, a lot of times what we will see with this type of shift, we start to see the ocean and the atmosphere couple. One of the key ingredients is that rapid drop off of the Southern Oscillation Index. And then we keep this going. All right. We keep this force going. And the latest Copernicus 3 model output here, all right, just came out on the 10th. This incorporates all these different models that you see up here. And two of them are obviously the Bureau of Meteorology, the European, the American, right there, too, Japanese, and so on and so forth. But you can see what these models are doing. As I've said, I'm not so much focused in these outer periods, all right? We'll worry about that when we get there. I have been most focused about the rapid change here from where we are right now, right through June. And notice all of those lines closely packed together. So even if you just kind of take the mean, that's where you go. By June, we're up here at a degree Celsius above average out there in the Central Pacific. And off the west coast of South America will likely be even warmer than that. And then in these outer periods, the Copernicus 3 has us way up here. Some of the members have us way up here above +3. Others have us down here near zero. Again, some of these are outliers. Reality is probably going to be, at least by September, somewhere at or above 2 degrees Celsius above average for that. Now, remember, typical El Ninos do not max out until we get into the late fall and winter season. Usually around December is when they max out. So if we're already sitting by September at 2 degrees C above average, this definitely has potential to be a high-end event. And the European seasonal model forecast shows that trend too. Remember, I'm really focused on the rate of change from now to June. Very good agreement with the model, high confidence in where we're headed, right? And the European even has us up here above 1 degree Celsius. And then out here in these outer periods, you can see that they're a little bit more uncertain with the intensity, but everything's steaming that way. The relative Nino index, which actually takes a little bit off the top because of how it's measured, from the Bureau of Meteorology out of Australia, does the same thing. In fact, by September, look at it, September. It has us technically into super El Nino status by September. Same deal, though. I'm focused on this rate of change and how we go from where we are right now, all right, or where we were there in March and in April, all the way up here to over 1 degree C above average in there. Very impressive move. Very impressive move. I will worry about the strength of this event later, but just know my feeling on it. Yes, it's going to be a strong event. So here's kind of a brief summary of what's going on. I know that's a lot of crap that I've thrown at you, but it's all, in my mind, very important. I've just been crazy geeking out on this stuff because I think it's so important. We've got a crashing Southern Oscillation Index that's likely to stay negative. Again, that is the atmosphere and the ocean talking to one another, becoming coupled and moving in that El Nino direction. The MJO continues to move into more favorable phases for the west and the southwest high plains. All right. Even the southeast, which has been seeing such dryness, the MJO is moving into better phases. The positive and warm Pacific Meridional mode, yeah, going to stay that way. Don't see that changing. And the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, the AMO, is either going to be far less positive or even negative and cool, as shown by that metric from Colorado State University. So there are a lot of things working in our favor for drought reduction, if you will, better rain chances. Now, as I've said, I know we have some dry soil and some drought to overcome, and that's never very easy considering where we've been if we don't have everything working together. But we have so many things working together that the evidence to me is overwhelming that we will see this pivot. It just has to pivot. Let's look at these analogs. And what I've done is I've used a website from Iowa State University to break these down into climate districts across the country into these separate years. So we're going to look at these years: 57, 65, 72, 82, 97, 2015 and 2023. And I have my favorites in here. I do. And 1982 is one of them. But I'll explain more about that here in just a second. Let's look at the precipitation anomalies for 1957, knowing what you know. This is what April looked like for 1957. It got wet. In fact, the number ones mean that's the wettest April on record out of 134 total years here. Out of those 134 total years, it's the wettest one. All right. But look at this. We've got some 7s up here in Colorado. We've got some 10s here. And that's a top 10 wettest April out of the past 134 years. All right. Whenever you're seeing, and just keep in mind, while the 1 would be the wettest April out of that 134, 134 would be the driest that would show up. But so you can see parts of the east and the southeast, they were dry. All right. Eastern North Carolina, South Carolina, down here, they were drier. All right. What about May's? That is the second wettest May out of that 134 years. Right there. Still, 7th wettest here. Look at this. Look at the wet signal here in southern Kansas, all the way up through the western high plains. Do you see how we pivoted not just for these areas to southeast, but also farther north and northwest? All right. And we stayed wet out west too. What about June? June, we stayed somewhat wetter here across parts of the plains. We were drier here in eastern New Mexico. Texas started to dry out after a very wet previous 2 months right there. July, see this? After going from such a wet spring, look at that. That means there were only 3 other years out of that 134 that were drier for that climate region here in Southwest Texas, right? And we started to dry out here in the plains yet again. Monsoon season, look at that. Southeast Arizona, very, very dry. The monsoon was very narrow and went like this, at least initially, until we got into August and it spread out just a little bit more. But look at August here. Southern Kansas, very, very dry. Back-to-back dry months in July and August there. September, no late season monsoon out here. And we were in El Nino at that time. We were very much in El Nino. But we did get wetter here through the middle part of the country after those previous 2 months. But we stayed fairly dry there in West Texas. Wetter southeast. 1957, not my top analog. Not in the basement, not my top. Precipitation for 1965, April. We were wet in the southwest, all right? We've been wetter farther east Texas, but there's some dryness here. Notice, okay, for some of these areas that have been dry during April. Wetter over the top. We continued that signature. Wetter through that corridor. Kind of an interesting configuration, but notice the dryness that it has here across the southeast. Very typical of what we've got going on right now for April. In May, this is interesting. We stayed very dry. Some of the driest Mays on record came in 1965 here in the east and the southeast. Interestingly enough, we had some significant flooding here in eastern Colorado, despite the fact that we're not off the top, you know, in terms of wetter. We greatly reduced some of that dry signal, and we shoved a lot of moisture farther west here, central and west Texas into New Mexico. We were wet in Wyoming, wet in the northern part of the plains. What about June? Very, very wet here in June. These were flooding months, all right? These were big flooding months here in eastern Colorado, western Kansas, southwest Nebraska. June of 1965, we had a big trough coming out of the west and southwest. But notice, while West Texas was wetter, look how much the central and eastern part of Texas, Oklahoma, and this sector started to dry out during June. Look at that. July of 65, the same signature. Look at the late monsoon here. And look at the dry signal to show it. Late monsoon here in the southwest. Didn't show up in July. Very dry. And look at the dryness here across parts of the southern plains and down along the Gulf Coast. August of 65, we were still somewhat wet here across eastern Colorado and western Kansas. We got wetter out in the Pacific Northwest. But notice the monsoon failing here in the south and the southwest. in August of 65. Drier in south across most of Texas, and you know that there will be some heat there if we're dry. September of 65, we never really saw a huge monsoonal recovery, but we did get wetter everywhere. In fact, September of 65, wettest on record right there for areas right there around Wichita in that climate district. All right. Wettest up here around Norfolk, Nebraska. Wettest in Cheyenne. All right. Top 10 wettest in the northern Front Range of Colorado. And several a lot of wet areas up here in western Montana, too. That's 1965, not my top analog. 72. This is where we started in April. Look at the dryness here over the southeast. We were wetter through this corridor here, dry here in the southwest across the western high plains. So there's some things to look at there. That was for April. Similar to kind of where we are right now. Not perfect, but similar. May, notice the area that got wet there. We were drier here. In fact, in some cases, close to record dryness there in southeast Kansas, southwestern Missouri. The thing that was interesting to me about 1972 was we weren't really completely coupled with the atmosphere and the ocean with this move toward El Nino in the early spring of 72. It took a while. June, we got wetter in the southwest, early monsoon onset here. But look at the dryness here in 72 from the southern plains into the Midwest. Wettest June on record in the Northeast for a lot of those areas. July, look at this. No huge monsoonal push here in Arizona, Utah. Sporadically wet here and there. All right. But not crazy. One of the main reasons is because our Atlantic wasn't cool in 72. All right. Our Pacific Meridiano mode wasn't warm. We weren't really matching things up with what can truly benefit us. So just because we were going toward an El Nino doesn't mean it responded as such. All right. August, we were wet along the Front Range. Nice monsoonal push here in New Mexico, but we had some dry pockets here and there. That dryness reappeared over the southeast again, but not crazy for most of the plains. And September, we were still somewhat dry. South Dakota, northern Nebraska, very dry down here. Very atypical of an El Nino to have this type of almost record dryness in September. But I think that owes to the hurricane season shutting down here in the southeast. All right. And we really hadn't seen that big subtropical jet push across the southern tier. So 1972, again, not my top analog with this. Our anomalies for 82. Look at 82. How does this closely mimic to where we are in the plains, but not in the southeast? We were actually wetter in the southeast, all right? We started to get wet out in California as the pattern broke down and as the Southern Oscillation Index started to drop, all right? But we were struggling with dryness here through the western high plains, big time. What about May? Talk about a switch. Look at that. Moisture came up out of the Gulf. We were drier over the southeast. Our Bermuda high was in place. We were surging moisture out of the Gulf, west and northwestward. We were drying out the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. Very typical of an El Nino when we really flipped the switch, all right? June, same story, but look who's drying out in June. South and southeast Texas, okay? That starts that drying out process, even though a good part of those areas were still showing up wetter than average. Monsoon wasn't showing up out here just yet in the southwest. July, we started to see better monsoonal flow, but we were still okay. Notice the areas that were drying out, though. Southeast Texas, down along the Gulf Coast, all right? Kind of an aberration here in central Nebraska, to be honest, all right? But you were wetter in western Nebraska, southeast Wyoming, northeast Colorado, and doing okay for most of Kansas until you got to the southeast corner. Certainly wetter farther northwest you go. A little bit different animal right there. August, monsoon shows up. We dry things out in West Texas, southeast or southwest Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle. All right. We were probably bringing storms through this sector here, would be my guess, off the Cheyenne Ridge, riding their way southeastward through Nebraska, southwest Iowa, into Missouri, over here in the Mississippi Valley. But they were missing areas here across parts of the southwest high plains. And then for September, all right, we were still dealing with some dryness here for some of these areas. Maybe not down here in southwest Louisiana, but certainly Texas, Oklahoma, most of Kansas, southwest Missouri. And we were wetter here with the monsoon. Probably some tropical activity coming up off the Baja too that kept these areas wet. Remember, these ones are the wettest September out of that 134-year period. So my guess is a lot of tropical activity coming up in this part of the area, all the way into Montana, where you were wetter. What about 97? April of 97, we got wet all the way up into southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, all right, because we were already moving that direction, all right, in terms of this El Nino event. We were still having some La Nina to overcome, but we made that move early into April. May, notice what happened in May. We kind of shut off here. That month happened a little bit earlier, all right? But we were kind of drier than average for May of 97 through here. Interesting, huh? Then we turned it back on in June. Wetter than average here. Wetter than average out west. New Mexico was wetter. We had moisture here across parts of the mid-south and southeast. July, we turned off dry, especially in these areas. Could have included them too. We were wet up here across the northern Rockies and northern plains. Not a complete failure here across parts of the plains, but not necessarily wet. We go to August, we were wetter, okay? Still somewhat dry down here in south and southeast Texas, also across the southeast and mid-Atlantic. And then September, again, more flow doing this. We were okay through most of the plains, still somewhat dry across parts of Texas. Eastern Montana and northern plains kind of dried out. Some of that wetness was focused west. 2015, probably second on my list right now. In April, we got wet in Texas, all the way actually up here into the southeast part of Wyoming, western Nebraska, Colorado. Obviously, this is probably not going to happen for us unless we really finish April with a bang. But May was bonkers. Look at this, or I should say, yeah, May. Look at the ones here on the map. 2015 was just off the chain here across the plains, not only the western plains, central plains, northern plains, even back out here in the Intermountain West. Wettest May on record wherever you're seeing a 1 for that climate district. June, we still had some of that going on. Now we dried out across some parts of Kansas. Look how wet we were through here in the Corn Belt. Again, the ones, that's the wettest June on record for those areas. Drier northwest, typical of an El Nino up here, at least for June. Then we turn it on again in July. Look at these numbers in July. Still wetter than average for most, but we started to dry it out down here, east and southeast Texas. Monsoon was going great. August, we started to dry out again across the region. Still okay in places, and not crazy dry for most. There's a couple of nasty spots in here, but just less wet, I think, would be the better way to put that. And then September, we were still somewhat drier here in the middle part. Sometimes that can happen, all right? Texas, east over toward the Mississippi Valley, some parts of the western and central plains too, all right? And then if we look at 2023, April of 23, we got lucky here late in April with one storm. But the problem is it didn't get everybody, right? We were dry in the southwest. We were wetter here. So that's a little bit atypical in the southeast. What happened in May? We went nuts through this corridor. Again, southwest Nebraska, that climate district right there, Imperial, McCook, Benkelman, Stratton, all the way back down here in northeast Colorado, northwest Kansas, very wet during May of 23. We were drier farther east, all right? Most of that moisture was shoved west. And then if we look at June, wettest June on record here in northeast Colorado for both of those climate districts. Southeast Colorado, the same story. But notice what happened here. We were drying out. And that started pretty early, right? July, very late monsoon arrival here. Look at how dry it was here across western Colorado and really across most of the West. We were still doing okay here because we were recycling all that moisture. We got wetter here too in July. August was brutal down here across a good part of eastern New Mexico, Texas, southern Oklahoma, and the Gulf Coast. It was hot too. Big push of moisture here. I believe that might have been the remnants of what was Hurricane Hillary that came up out of the Baja. And we had good rains doing this too. September, kind of a mixed bag. We broke some of that dryness across some parts of Texas, but not entirely. We were still somewhat dry here in the midsection of the country too, wetter over the top and out west. 2023, why wouldn't 2023 be one of my favorites as far as the analog? Because the Atlantic was warmer than where it is now. And a lot of times when that happens, it shuts the moisture off for some parts of the plains, just as it did in 2023 across Oklahoma, parts of Texas. All right. So let's pair what the models are saying. European seasonal model, just the precipitation anomaly forecast for April through October. Look where it has it dry. I think it did a very good job analyzing this in terms of where the wettest corridor was going to be. Did a nice job initializing with the dryness in the southeast and out here in the western high plains. All right. We could probably, the only thing I'd probably do is maybe expand this dryness a little farther to the east. All right. But not a lot. And we're wetter up here in Montana and parts of the Dakotas. Now in May, this is the Euro seasonal model forecast in May. Look at the moisture signal here. Right up out of the Gulf. The dryness relaxes across the southeast. We push that moisture so far west across New Mexico, most of Colorado, western Nebraska, South Dakota, all the way into Montana. Does it continue? Notice the little bit of a dry signal that starts to develop in the Pacific Northwest. We have some dry signal here, Great Lakes, and across parts of the Corn Belt. Not catastrophic, just the flavor is a little drier than average. And in June, look at that. It completely reverses on the year. Now, if these anomalies were just showing up as light green, I'd be like, okay, well, maybe we've got some room for wiggle here back toward dry. Look at these anomalies. Look at the blues showing up down here. All right. This is a very wet signal for this corridor here. From all the way from southwest Missouri, western Arkansas, Louisiana, all the way northwest to south and southeast Montana. And the core of that drier signal is pushed a little farther to the northwest as well. But June, in typical, what would inevitably be classical El Nino fashion, where the North Atlantic is cooler, maybe not cool, just cooler, and we have the warmth out there in the Pacific, not only with the Pacific Meridional mode, but also with the El Nino going on. And then if we go to July, we continue with that. Now, notice in July, we start to dry this out. Central and East Texas, down along the Gulf Coast, typical of an El Nino. We also have a little bit of a diminished monsoon signal here, all right, coming out of Mexico into southeast Arizona and New Mexico. That better channel, perhaps, is situated there. What about August? We still have that diminished monsoon signal per the model here across parts of Arizona, southwest New Mexico. Again, maybe not a complete failure, but the indication of those light brown or that slightly tipped toward a drier than average flavor is still very present there. Notice who still stays wet: western Kansas, eastern Colorado, most of Nebraska, all the way up here into parts of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. We're a little bit drier out here in parts of the midsection in August, and still drier through that corridor that I worry about more. Southeast Kansas, most of Oklahoma, East Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana. September, I'm not sure what this little bit of a dry signal is here because it's bookended by wet. All right. Look at how wet it gets here in the midsection of the country, and we stay wet northwest. And this is something that I really think is important. Do you see all of these wet anomalies out here? All right. Off the Baja. I think the Eastern Pacific hurricane season is going to be an active one. Right here off the west coast of New Mexico, or west coast of Mexico, and that a lot of times can sneak moisture into the southwest. So that's why I'm not totally sold on this dry pocket here for September that I have highlighted. And if we go to October, we light things up big time pretty much everywhere. That would indicate to me powerhouse of a subtropical jet, seasonal change systems coming in here, and you get kind of a perfect storm here. Long ways out there. Don't want to worry about that yet. Just the trend as far as the modeling. But some of those anomalies are pretty hard to ignore. If we look at the Copernicus 3 seasonal model forecast, precipitation-wise, again, this is just May through September. This is May. So you get a little bit of a dry pocket here off the Pacific coast and Pacific Northwest. But notice you're wetter here, all right? Coming out of Mexico northward. No stout dry signal anywhere here. Maybe a little tip here, just north of the Great Lakes, but nothing crazy. What about June? Wetter signal here, all right? This would indicate an earlier onset of the monsoon signal in the southwest. And look at the little splotchy areas of green here. That would indicate wetter conditions to me in the midsection of the country. The dry signal is positioned way up here to the northwest or down here across the Caribbean and the Gulf, which indicates to me that the Atlantic hurricane season would follow suit with an El Nino and would be considerably diminished, all right? Especially down here in the Caribbean and the Southern Gulf. July, same story. Look where the dry pocket is. That dryness starts to edge up here in the South and Southeast Texas along the Gulf Coast, just like the Euro was showing, just like a lot of times those analogs will show. And notice who's wet, all the way up here into Montana. And I know the state border's on here, but you can get the idea that that tropical moisture is going this way. And there's no dry signal out here anywhere in the midsection of the country at all, not even a light dry signal, right? August, big push of moisture here, favors still the western high plains, driest down here, South and Southeast Texas, lower Mississippi Valley, on out here, okay, into the Caribbean and the Atlantic. September, I think, again, big push of moisture here is what the model is showing, and that still favors a lot of the west and the southwest along the western high plains. Still no, look at little spots of green out here. Still no dryas. Dryas is way down here. So just with the Euro, and the European model is part of the Copernicus 3, but just with the Euro looking at it separately and in conjunction with the Copernicus 3, there's a couple of things here that I want you to take away. There doesn't appear to be, despite what we're dealing with now, with the drought that encompasses a large part of the country, there doesn't appear to be a gigantic dry signal that perpetuates through the warm season with all these models. And the same thing could be said in those analogs, that while we may start dry initially, a lot of drought maintenance gets erased because the pattern changes in such a stark way. And if we do that, there's no heat signal. I could have shown you the temperature maps right there. The only heat signal that pops up is in the Pacific Northwest, not across the middle part of the country. And that is something that's been very consistent with the Canadian model and also the European model, that there hasn't been a big heat signal in the middle part of the country. Now, that being said, I will say that those areas that tend to favor drying out, Southeast Kansas, Southwest portion, or down into East and Southeast Oklahoma, and into East and Southeast Texas, when those areas dry out, there is always the propensity for some heat to build in to those spots, especially when they do it from mid to late June, July, and August. So as I've said, I think those areas need to be most prepared for some flash drought because they're wetter now. And then you shut that off, and you might have to be concerned about that for some flash drought. But that's something to worry about a little bit down the road. Folks, this is just kind of owes to what I've been talking about now for a while, and I wanted to share a lot of the real technical support for why I'm saying the things that I'm saying, because I think those indices and those oscillations make a lot of sense to really pay attention to as we go forward. Because this movement toward El Nino, it's a big one. It's a big push out of what we have seen prevail for the better portion of the past year. Even if it was just weak La Nina conditions, those weak La Nina conditions have an impact as we've seen. As always, folks, Thank you so much for watching and listening to the Desert Farmer podcast. I always appreciate your feedback and the interaction with you, especially on our YouTube platform. So please feel free to do that. If you say, Brian, you're completely wrong on this, hey, I get it. I'll have that conversation with you. But I've just tried to do the best that I could to throw that evidence your way to give you something to think about as to show why I'm thinking the way that I'm thinking. Folks, you be well, and we'll be chatting with you again real soon right here on the Desert Farmer podcast. Take care.